Israel once again claimed that Hamas violated the ceasefire and, citing the death of an Israeli soldier, launched large-scale bombardment across Gaza, killing at least 104 Palestinians, including 46 children. Hamas rejected Israel's accusations, saying it had not violated the ceasefire. U.S. President Trump defended Israel's actions, saying Israelis carried out a retaliatory response and should do so. In blunt remarks, he warned that Hamas must behave or face being eliminated. "You have to understand, Hamas is a small part of the problem in the Middle East. If they behave, things will be fine. If they don't, they will be terminated. Their lives will be ended." Paraphrase of his statement. "I just heard that the latest alleged ceasefire breach by Israeli forces in Gaza, and the subsequent huge bombardment, followed an extraordinary statement issued yesterday from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office. That statement said that, after identification procedures, it was determined that a body returned overnight was one of the hostages who had been taken from Gaza and brought to Israel roughly 2 years ago. According to Israel, that act constituted a violation of the ceasefire by Hamas. Netanyahu convened security chiefs to consider possible responses to these alleged violations. After consultations with security advisors, he instructed the Israeli military to carry out strong operations in the Gaza Strip. Within hours, Israeli forces began large-scale strikes across Gaza. According to Gaza health authorities, in roughly a 12-hour window from Tuesday into Wednesday, Israeli attacks killed at least 104 Palestinians and wounded 253. Of the dead, 46 were children. Hamas denied Israel's claims and said it had already announced the return of 2 bodies in response to the dispute over alleged violations. CNN reported that, immediately after Netanyahu announced new strikes in Gaza, Hamas's military wing said it was delaying the return of one Israeli body that had been due to be handed over on Tuesday, blaming Israeli actions for the holdup. Hamas warned that any Israeli attempts to search for or recover bodies would disrupt recovery efforts and hinder the return of remains. Amid the heavy bombing across Gaza, Israeli forces formally announced they were suspending the ceasefire again. An Israeli military statement said, following political leadership guidance and in response to Hamas's alleged breaches, the army had resumed operations and would continue to act against any violations. This is not the first time Israel has accused Hamas of breaching the ceasefire. According to Al Jazeera, since the ceasefire resumed on October 11, at least 211 Palestinians have been killed and 597 wounded in Israeli strikes, per that report. The recent escalation has renewed fears that the ceasefire and the diplomatic progress achieved during the Trump administration could now be at risk. U.S. news outlet Axios reported that the ceasefire arrangements were arguably one of the biggest diplomatic achievements of President Trump's current term, but that the accord now appears fragile. In recent weeks the Trump administration has worked to shore up the ceasefire and pressure both sides to avoid actions that might end it. As part of this effort, U.S. officials sent senior envoys to Israel and set up a command center to monitor the situation. Rising tensions over the return of remains and the clashes that erupted in Rafah on Tuesday further accelerated Israeli calls for military action. Israeli officials said that on Tuesday, in southern Gaza's Rafah, Hamas fighters fired anti-tank missiles and sniper rounds at Israeli forces. An Israeli soldier was killed in that engagement. Israeli authorities claim that Hamas remains committed to the ceasefire in words but is undermining it with attacks and by delaying the return of remains. Reports say much of Rafah is under Israeli control, although some Hamas fighters continue to operate in the area using tunnels. The Rafah incident prompted intense exchanges of gunfire between Hamas fighters and Israeli forces. Before the Rafah clashes, Netanyahu had already consulted military leaders about new operations in Gaza, moves Israeli officials say were in response to alleged Hamas violations and the dispute over returning remains. Israeli officials also said Hamas has been slow to return the remains of 13 hostages still in Gaza. On Saturday, President Trump demanded Hamas immediately hand over the bodies and warned that if they did not, other parties involved in the ceasefire would take action. Trump acknowledged that, after the destruction in Gaza, recovering some remains can be difficult, but he said Hamas could still return some bodies, yet, for unclear reasons, it had not. Trump said he would watch the situation closely for 48 hours. Hours before that 48-hour window expired, Hamas did hand over one Israeli body. The next day, however, Israel said Hamas had only returned parts of that body, parts Israel had already recovered earlier. On Tuesday, Netanyahu called that action a violation of the ceasefire and, hours later, the Israeli military released a 15-minute drone video showing people placing a body into a bag, lowering it into a dug hole, covering it with rubble, then bringing a bulldozer and later returning with Red Cross personnel, apparently intended to show that a body had been exhumed. Israeli officials said they had shown the video to the Trump administration and the CIA, calling it a breach of the agreement and insisting Israel would respond. U.S. Officials, however, cautioned Netanyahu's team not to view that single incident as a major ceasefire breach and advised Israel to avoid a heavy-handed response that could collapse the deal. Nevertheless, Netanyahu called an emergency meeting to consider possible retaliatory options. Israeli options reportedly included resuming large-scale airstrikes and reasserting control over areas it already holds under the ceasefire. One Israeli official said the meeting ended without a final decision, and Netanyahu stressed that any future moves would need to be coordinated with the United States. Immediately after that meeting, Hamas announced it had found another Israeli body in Khan Yunis and said it would hand it over on Tuesday, but soon after, clashes erupted in Rafah, Netanyahu announced strikes, and Hamas said it would no longer return bodies. Qatar, which has acted as a mediator in ceasefire negotiations, also reacted. Al Jazeera reported Qatari Foreign Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani telling a Council on Foreign Relations session that recent Israeli actions were violations of the deal. He added that, fortunately, both parties still appear to accept the need for the ceasefire and urged efforts to keep it in place. Pakistan strongly condemned the alleged breach of the ceasefire and the recent Israeli strikes in Gaza. Pakistan's Foreign Office said it condemns the latest Israeli operations that have resulted in civilian deaths, calling them a clear and grave violation of international law and the recent ceasefire agreement. Pakistan urged the international community to act to stop these violations and reiterated its support for a sovereign, geographically contiguous Palestinian state within the pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem, Al-Quds, as its capital. The current situation has increased concerns about the next phases of ceasefire implementation, Gaza's reconstruction, a full Israeli withdrawal, and establishment of an international stabilization force for Gaza. Media reports name several countries that might contribute to such a force. Pakistan's name has been mentioned, and Jordan also figures prominently. On October 27, Pakistan's army chief met King Abdullah of Jordan. That same day, King Abdullah told the BBC he hopes any stabilization force will genuinely maintain peace, and that if the force becomes a temporary or ill-defined arrangement, no one will accept it. Regarding Jordan's potential role, when asked whether Jordan would send gendarmes or soldiers to train local security forces in Gaza, the short answer was no. Jordan officials said they are too politically tied to the issue. They stressed that any stabilization security mission must focus on supporting local police and security capacity, not act as an occupying force. Jordan and Egypt are reportedly willing to provide training at scale, but such programs will take time. No country wants to be involved in operations that involve patrolling Gaza streets armed and engaging in combat.